Emma was laughing when it happened. Her hand was resting on her belly, the morning sun lighting up her face, and she was telling the goats to stop chewing on the rake again. I was halfway through fixing the barn door hinge, squinting into the light, when I heard the crunch of gravel. Then a voice that could sour milk. Karen. I didn't even turn around at first. She barked something about unauthorized gatherings and pregnancy livestock violations, which made absolutely no sense. Then, in one breathless moment that snapped the piece in two, Karen marched straight up and kicked my pregnant wife in the side. Emma gasped. I dropped the wrench. Time froze. Her hands shot to her belly as she stumbled back against the gate. Karen stood there, arms crossed, like she'd just done something noble. I don't remember what I said. I only remember the sound of the gate creaking and my own heartbeat roaring like a stampede in my ears. I ran to Emma, kneeling, eyes scanning her face. She was pale but breathing, blinking hard, trying not to cry, not for herself, for the baby. I pressed my hand gently to her hip, where the kick had landed, and whispered her name. She shook her head, telling me not to panic, but her voice was shaking. Behind me, Karen was still talking, something about how we were violating HOA livestock codes, and she was within her rights. Her voice was smug, clipped, the kind of tone you hear from someone who thinks the law is just a suggestion for other people. I turned slowly and looked at her, but I didn't move. Not yet. I walked to the tool bench by the barn. She thought I was going to grab a shovel. What I grabbed was older, quieter, and much more effective. In a wooden box covered in dust and chicken feathers sat my old trooper radio. I hadn't used it in years, but I kept it charged out of habit. Call it muscle memory. I flipped the switch. Static, then a pop, then the old familiar voice of dispatch. Unit 4 to base. Emergency on private land. Pregnant woman assaulted. Need backup. A beat of silence, then, like thunder cracking from heaven itself, the reply, 104 rolling code 3. That you, Cal? Trooper Jackson en route. 4 minutes. Karen laughed. She thought I was bluffing. She thought I was just some retired rancher playing cowboy. She didn't know the badge I wore wasn't some souvenir. It was earned. She didn't know that the man rolling in was someone I'd once pulled from a burning wreck with my bare hands. She had 4 minutes to find out who she had just kicked in the gut, figuratively and literally. Emma, seated now on a hay bale in the shade, tried to steady her breathing. I knelt beside her again, holding her hand. She gave me a small smile, brave and soft. She was always like that, the kind of woman who never raised her voice but could calm a storm with a look. Even in pain, even scared, she squeezed my hand and said, "We're okay. It's just Karen. She can't hurt us." I wished that were true. Karen had already hurt us, and she wasn't done. Now that she realized help was coming, Karen doubled down. She whipped out her phone and started filming, narrating like she was some victim in a made-for-TV movie. She panned across the barn, the goats, the hay, then focused on Emma, claiming she'd been attacked while enforcing HOA code. Her voice trembled in that fake way people use when they're putting on a show. I didn't say a word. Let the camera roll. Let it catch the truth. Let it catch the part where the woman with the clipboard assaulted a pregnant woman over a fence dispute. The neighbors started to arrive. First Mrs. Dalton from the Lavender Farm, then a lover from 2 plots over, then a couple of teenage boys on dirt bikes who parked and watched from a distance. Karen's voice got louder, trying to play to the crowd. She pointed at Emma, claiming she had faked the whole thing, that she threw herself against the gate to stage it, that I was an old burnout trying to play sheriff. I stayed kneeling next to my wife, but my ears were on the wind. I could hear the sirens, faint at first, then rising like a slow tidal wave. Karen heard them too. Her face changed, not fear, not yet. Confusion, maybe. Doubt. Then came the SUV, black and white, lights flashing. It didn't stop at the end of the lane like most cars. It rolled right through the open fence gate, across the gravel, and stopped 10 feet from Karen. Dust swirled. The door opened. Trooper Jackson stepped out, sunglasses, broad shoulders, the kind of presence that made people shut up without a word. Karen actually smiled. She took a step toward him like they were long-lost cousins, said something about being assaulted and needing protection. Jackson looked right past her, looked at me, then gave a nod. "Captain." Karen blinked. Her smile faltered. I stood up. Jackson walked over to Emma first, checked on her, asked if she needed an ambulance. She said, "No, not yet. Just needed to sit." Then he turned to Karen. "Can you explain what happened here?" Karen opened her mouth, but Jackson raised a hand. "No, man. I asked him. I laid it out plain and clean. No fluff, just the facts." Emma. "The gate, the kick, the footage, the witnesses, the badge I once carried, the boundaries of our land, miles from any HOA jurisdiction." Karen interrupted halfway through. Jackson shut her down. "Man, please step back. This is now a criminal investigation." That was the first time Karen's face showed real fear, not because she was sorry, but because for the first time in her HOA-fueled reign of terror, someone wasn't afraid of her clipboard or her threats. Jackson asked for my documentation. I pointed to the folder in the barn office. Karen tried to block the path. Jackson stepped in between and gently moved her aside, like she was a confused tourist trying to find the bathroom. It was beautiful. Emma exhaled, finally relaxing. I knelt back beside her. She looked at me and said, "I think the baby kicked." I smiled. So did Justice. And it had steel-toed boots. And Karen? She had about 3 more minutes of freedom left. Karen stood in the middle of our gravel driveway with her arms crossed like a school principal ready to hand out detentions. Only she had no authority here, and certainly no rules that applied beyond her HOA borders. The sirens had faded, but the weight they left behind was still thick in the air. Trooper Jackson had already radioed for backup, not because he needed it, but because a situation like this called for documentation, for presence, and for clarity. Karen wasn't just some annoying neighbor now. She had assaulted a pregnant woman, trespassed onto private land, and was still digging herself deeper with every word she said. Emma sat quietly on the shaded bench, sipping cool water. Her breathing was steadier now, and a soft pink had returned to her cheeks. I stayed close by, my arm resting on the back of the bench, just in case she needed anything. Emma wasn't the kind of person to complain, not even when she was hurting, and that was part of what made this whole thing so infuriating. She wasn't just my wife. She was the kind of person you felt lucky to be near, calm in chaos, gentle with every word, and Karen had walked onto our land and kicked her as if we were props in her power game. Karen was trying her best to reclaim control. She waved her phone at Jackson and shouted something about unlawful detainment that made one of the younger troopers chuckle under his breath. Karen caught it and turned her rage toward him, demanding badge numbers, badge names, even claiming she was part of a state HOA compliance committee. Jackson remained unreadable. He had the patience of a man who had written more reports than he'd had hot meals, and it served him well. He nodded along, taking notes, his pen moving slowly as Karen ranted. Then she tried something new. She started listing every HOA code she could remember, reading from a crumpled laminated sheet she kept in her oversized purse. She accused us of livestock noise violations, unapproved fencing height, unauthorized agricultural structures, and even improper dirt color. Dirt color. She said the dust from our driveway didn't match the aesthetic tone permitted by the HOA's natural palette guidelines. I stared at her, wondering if she practiced these lines in front of a mirror, or if this delusion came naturally. Jackson asked a simple question. "Man, where does the HOA property boundary end?" Karen pointed vaguely toward the mailbox. Jackson pulled out a printed parcel map and handed it to her. It clearly showed our land, our boundaries, and a large highlighted zone labeled non-HOA agricultural exempt. He let her stare at it for a moment, then gently asked again, "Are you aware this property does not fall under HOA jurisdiction?" Karen didn't answer. She turned red, her eyes flitting between the map and the goats, and then to the growing group of onlookers across the road. Our neighbors had started gathering in small clusters. Some leaned on fence posts. Others had folding chairs. Oliver from 2 doors down brought popcorn. Literally. He shook the bag and offered it to Mrs. Dalton, who was filming from her porch. I overheard her whispering to someone on speakerphone that Karen had finally snapped. It was a small town. News traveled fast, and when Karen was involved, people showed up. She had spent the past 2 years treating our area like her personal chessboard, slapping fines on people for unmowed grass or garden gnomes or flags that weren't aesthetically compliant. People were tired of her, and now they were watching the fall. Karen must have felt the shift in energy because she changed tactics again. She tried to cry. She pulled out tissues and told Jackson that she had only tried to stop a violent dog from attacking her. We didn't have a dog. Then she said Emma had threatened her first. Emma hadn't said more than 10 words to her. Then she said she had been invited onto the property to conduct an inspection. Jackson asked who had invited her. She pointed at me. I raised an eyebrow. Jackson didn't even write that part down. He just kept the same patient expression, like a school teacher waiting for a child to admit they broke the window. I excused myself for a moment to fetch the manila folder from the barn office. It was thick and dusty but well organized. Inside were property deeds, a copy of the county zoning exemption, and even a signed letter from a judge confirming we were outside of all HOA oversight. I handed it to Jackson, who flipped through it quickly and nodded. Then he turned to Karen. "Ma'am, you are currently on private property without permission, and based on the witness statements and physical evidence, you are being cited for trespassing and assault." Karen's voice cracked. She tried to argue, but it came out as a strained whisper. "You don't understand. I'm on the board. I'm the only thing keeping this place civilized. If I don't enforce order, who will?" Jackson didn't flinch. He handed her a citation slip and told her she had the right to contest it in court. Then he informed her that if she didn't leave immediately, she'd be detained. Karen's eyes scanned the crowd again. No sympathy, not anymore. Just folding arms, quiet stares, and a few smirks. The goats bleated from behind the fence like they were part of the jury. She turned back to Jackson and asked, "Is this really how this town works? You let animals and retirees run the place?" Jackson replied without emotion, "No, ma'am. We let the law run it." Karen finally backed away, muttering threats about lawsuits and appeals. She promised she'd be back with a lawyer, a news crew, maybe even a private investigator. Jackson simply said, "We'll be here." And he turned his attention back to Emma, asking if she'd like a ride to the hospital for a checkup. Emma shook her head and thanked him softly. I stood next to her, proud and protective. Karen crossed the property line, still looking back every few steps like someone leaving a crime scene who hadn't quite accepted it yet. Once she was out of sight, the troopers relaxed a little. The younger one took off his sunglasses and whistled low. "That woman's a one-person lawsuit generator." Jackson chuckled and said, "That wasn't a citizen complaint. That was a demolition attempt." The radio crackled again. More backup was arriving, just in case. Emma leaned her head against my shoulder. Her breathing was steady. Her hand rested on her belly again. The baby kicked. I looked around. The barn, the trees, the sky turning gold. This was our land, and now, finally, the law had drawn the line where the fence did. The Karen storm had passed for now, but we all knew she wasn't done. Not yet. The air hung thick with the kind of tension that doesn't leave easily. Karen might have stomped off the property, but her presence still lingered like the smell of burnt plastic. Emma sat quietly, her hands still resting on her belly, her eyes half closed. I had fetched a damp cloth from the house and gently placed it behind her neck to help cool her down. The goats had long wandered to the far end of the pen, sensing the chaos was over, and even the chickens were quiet, pecking near the feed bins without their usual squawking. But I knew better. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of whatever Karen had planned next. Trooper Jackson stood near the gate, talking into his radio in short, clipped sentences. He was already requesting a full incident report from the station, and I could hear him asking dispatch to pull any past complaints from the HOA involving Karen. The younger trooper, Barnes, paced the driveway with his notepad, checking details and interviewing witnesses. Oliver was more than happy to give his statement, describing the entire event down to the angle of Karen's high heel when she kicked. I couldn't help but crack a smile as Oliver mimicked Karen's voice, fluttering his hands and pretending to wave a clipboard like a magic wand. I stepped into the barn office to grab the rest of the documentation: old surveys, aerial images, even a copy of a letter from the county clerk confirming our exemption from HOA oversight. It was all organized in a battered green folder I had kept since the day we bought the land. It had never seemed that important until today. As I handed the folder to Jackson, I noticed the way his expression shifted. He knew. He understood that what Karen had done wasn't just a nuisance or a mistake. It was premeditated trespassing made worse by assault, and it had been done with full confidence that she would get away with it. Jackson flipped through the folder slowly. He paused on the aerial map, tapped the legend with his pen, then pointed to the faded yellow line that marked the edge of HOA control. It was over 200 feet from our barn gate. That distance might as well have been a mile, legally speaking. He asked me if Karen had ever confronted us before. I told him, no, not directly, but she had left printed HOA warnings in our mailbox more than once. She had complained about the sound of the rooster, the placement of our compost pile, and once accused us of lowering property values because our barn roof wasn't painted beige. But we had always ignored her. We figured she'd get bored. Clearly, we were wrong. Outside, Barnes was wrapping up with the neighbors. A few of them stayed to help put away fallen flower pots and refill the animal water troughs that had been knocked over in the scuffle. Even the teenagers with the dirt bikes helped straighten the gate and sweep up spilled feed. Small town kindness. That was the reason we moved here. That and the space, the quiet, the hope of raising a child somewhere that felt untouched by the world's chaos. Karen had cracked that hope for a moment, but as I watched these people step in without being asked, I realized she hadn't broken it. If anything, she'd reinforced it. Then, like a bad rerun, Karen's voice returned, distant at first. She wasn't on our land this time, but close enough to be heard. She had set up camp near the edge of the road, right at the end of the HOA border. From there, she held up a sign. At first, I thought it said something about private property. Then I saw the full message. It was handwritten in black marker across a foam board and read, "Caution. Aggressive farm people ahead. Do not engage." Jackson saw it too. He didn't say anything, just shook his head inside. Then he walked to the edge of our property and called out to her. "Ma'am, I strongly advise you to stop antagonizing these residents. This is not helping your situation." Karen just waved her clipboard and shouted back something about free speech and neighborhood preservation. Barnes looked at Jackson and quietly asked if she was okay mentally. Jackson didn't answer, but his silence said enough. As the troopers prepared to leave, Jackson pulled me aside. He told me he'd be recommending an emergency restraining order to the county judge and that an officer would check in periodically over the next few days. He also asked if I wanted to press formal charges. I looked at Emma, who was now inside, resting on the couch with her feet up and a warm blanket over her legs. She was sipping tea and watching the goats through the window. Her strength amazed me. I nodded to Jackson. "Yes, we're pressing charges." Before they left, Barnes handed me a small voice recorder and said they'd appreciate it if I kept track of any further interactions with Karen, no matter how small. I agreed. I had a feeling we'd need it. As their SUV pulled away, kicking up a soft trail of dust, I stood by the gate and looked toward the road. Karen was still standing there with her ridiculous sign, but now she was on a phone call, pacing in tight circles like a dog tethered too close to a tree. I went back inside. Emma smiled when she saw me and reached for my hand. She asked how it ended. I told her the troopers were handling it. She didn't ask for details. She didn't have to. She knew this wasn't over, but she also knew we weren't alone anymore. Later that evening, as the sky turned a deep shade of orange and the crickets began their nightly chorus, I sat on the porch with a glass of iced tea. The barn lights flicked on automatically, casting a soft glow across the field. I heard the goats settling down and the wind moving through the tall grass. Everything looked normal, peaceful, but I felt a change in the air. Karen's stunt had triggered something bigger than she anticipated. I had spent years enforcing laws, breaking up fights, dealing with the worst sides of people, but nothing ever felt as personal as today. This wasn't just about land or boundaries or even the kick. It was about the kind of world we wanted to raise our child in. A world where bullies with boardrooms and clipboards didn't get to write the rules for everyone else. I looked out over the field toward the dark edge of the HOA property line. Karen was gone now, maybe just for the night, but I had no doubt she'd be back. And next time, I'd be ready. Not with force, not with anger, but with truth, with law, with neighbors who cared more about right than rules. The kind of quiet strength you don't need to shout about. The kind of strength Emma had shown without saying a word. The next morning, the sun rose without drama, spilling golden light across the pasture and through the barn windows, as if trying to pretend the day before had never happened. But no amount of sunshine could erase the memory of Karen's kick, or the wild-eyed look she wore as she screamed legal nonsense from our gate. I had barely sipped my coffee when I saw her again. This time, she was in different clothes. She wore a beige windbreaker with a fake-looking badge clipped to the collar and aviator sunglasses that were far too large for her face. In one hand, she held her clipboard again, but now it had a printed sheet on top with bold letters that read, Community Environmental Safety Patrol. I stared at her through the kitchen window. Emma was still asleep on the couch, her hand gently resting on her belly. I didn't want her to wake up to more of this. Karen didn't step onto the property this time, at least not yet. She stayed just outside the boundary line, standing near the drainage ditch that ran along the gravel path. From there, she began filming again. Her voice echoed through the quiet morning as she gave some bizarre monologue about unregulated animal waste, illegal compost piles, and threats to the HOA ecosystem. I walked outside calmly and stood by the gate, not saying anything at first. She pointed her phone at me and called me the suspect in an ongoing disturbance investigation. I almost laughed. I asked her plainly what she was doing. She puffed out her chest and said she was gathering evidence for the HOA's newly established Rural Oversight Task Force. I told her to step back 5 feet because she was still standing on the edge of my land, and I had clear documentation to prove it. She argued that the property line was disputed, which was a lie, and then accused me of contaminating HOA grounds with airborne pollen from our wildflowers. That was a new one. I let her talk. I had turned on the small voice recorder Trooper Barnes gave me and slipped it in my pocket. Everything she said, every baseless claim, every accusation was now being preserved. Suddenly, Karen darted forward, not onto the property, but toward the goat pen fence. She shouted something about unauthorized livestock proximity to a shared border. She raised her clipboard as if preparing to take photos or start measuring the distance between the fence and her sidewalk. As she leaned over the edge, one of our goats, an ornery billy named Commander, took interest. Commander was known for 2 things. 1, eating anything that looked remotely like paper. 2, not appreciating people who got too close without treats. Karen, of course, had paper. She had a whole clipboard full of it. Commander trotted over with his usual sideways head bob, gave one good sniff, and then, in a flash, chomped down on the corner of her top sheet. Karen shrieked. She stumbled back, yanked her clipboard upward, and in doing so, lost her balance. Her foot slipped on a patch of damp grass near the ditch. Down she went, feet in the air, clipboard flying, phone skidding across the gravel. It was all so fast and yet so slow. She landed squarely in the muddy ditch water with a splash that sent 2 frogs leaping in opposite directions. I covered my mouth, not in shock, but in an attempt to stop myself from laughing. Oliver, who had come by to check on the fencing, saw the whole thing and let out a wheezy chuckle from across the pasture. Karen sputtered, tried to get up, slipped again, and finally managed to crawl to the edge, soaked and humiliated. Her sunglasses were missing. Her windbreaker was coated in brownish-green muck. Commander stared at her, chewing the corner of her paper like it was the best thing he'd ever tasted. Karen didn't yell this time. She didn't make a scene. She just scrambled to her feet, grabbed her soggy clipboard and muddy phone, and limped off toward the HOA road without a word. I stood there, stunned by the silence. No threat, no lawsuit, just the sound of squishing shoes and one very confused goat. Oliver walked up beside me and muttered that he wished he'd filmed it. I told him not to worry. The voice recorder had caught the audio, and the goats were probably better witnesses than any human could be. Later that afternoon, I got a call from Trooper Jackson. He said the county judge had approved the temporary restraining order and that a formal court date would be set within the next 10 days. Karen would be served papers by the end of the evening. He also told me he'd spoken to several neighbors who had submitted written complaints about Karen's behavior over the past year. Apparently, she had been keeping files on at least 6 other households. One neighbor was fined for planting tomatoes in their front yard. Another was cited for having a blue picnic table. It was clear now that Karen had appointed herself as some sort of enforcer without any real authority. When Emma woke up, I told her everything. She laughed harder than I had heard her laugh in weeks. When I described how Commander had chomped down on the clipboard and sent Karen flying into the ditch, she held her belly and said the baby kicked from joy. She asked if I was sure the goat didn't plant it. I told her if he did, he deserved a medal. As evening came, the air turned cooler. The troopers returned briefly to deliver the restraining order. They posted a copy near the gate and took photos for documentation. Karen was not seen again that day. I figured she was licking her wounds somewhere, maybe soaking in a tub and plotting her next dramatic return. I doubted it would be her last visit, but I felt better knowing the law was on our side now, in writing. The quiet returned slowly. First, the goats resumed their usual games of butting heads near the water trough. Then the chickens came out to peck at the grass near the porch. Emma and I sat together in the rocking chairs, sipping lemonade and watching the sky melt into orange. We talked about baby names. She liked Rose. I liked June. We both agreed that whatever name we chose, it should mean strength, not revenge, not pride, but resilience. The kind of strength that stays quiet until needed, the kind that holds the line and never bows to bullying. Out in the field, Commander stood tall, still chewing the last shred of Karen's clipboard. I raised my glass to him. That goat had done more for neighborhood justice than any committee meeting ever had. We didn't know what Karen would try next, but we knew this much. She had finally met her match. Not in me, not even in the law, but in a muddy ditch at the feet of a goat, surrounded by people who were no longer willing to let her terrorize their peace. The courthouse was small, the kind of building that smelled faintly of old paper and fresh coffee, tucked between the town's post office and the hardware store. I had been there a handful of times in my life, mostly to get permits or pay taxes, never to press charges. But now, sitting on the wooden bench outside the courtroom doors with Emma beside me and our lawyer reviewing documents, it felt different. It felt like the quiet before a storm we didn't ask for but had no choice but to face. Emma wore a soft blue dress and held her belly gently with both hands. She looked calm, but I could feel the tension in the way her thumb rubbed slow circles along the side of her hand. The courtroom door opened with a creak, and we were called inside. Karen was already seated at the defendant's table, flanked by a lawyer who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. She wore a neck brace, a black dress, and an expression that could only be described as forced fragility. The moment she saw Emma, she looked away, as if the sight of a woman she had kicked was too much even for her to perform around. The judge entered, and everyone stood. Judge Mitchell was old school, sharp-eyed, and known for having no patience for nonsense. He adjusted his glasses, looked at both parties, and asked for a brief summary. Our lawyer stood first. He spoke clearly and without drama, presenting the facts: the date of the incident, the video from the barn security camera, the audio recording from the voice recorder, witness testimonies from Oliver and 2 other neighbors, the documentation proving our land was outside HOA jurisdiction. Then he handed over the restraining order and described Karen's continued harassment even after it was filed. The judge listened without interruption, taking notes slowly, occasionally nodding. When it was Karen's turn, her lawyer stood reluctantly. He began with a tone that tried to sound sympathetic but couldn't hide the strain. He claimed that Karen had been under emotional duress, that she had misunderstood the property lines, and that she never intended to cause harm. Then, in a move that made Emma stiffen beside me, Karen herself stood up without waiting for the judge's permission. She began speaking directly to him. She said she had been protecting the neighborhood, that the livestock posed a threat to property values, that she believed Emma was trespassing on public land when the alleged incident occurred. She used the word alleged 5 times. The judge held up a hand. "Ma'am, this is not a zoning meeting. This is a courtroom. Please sit down." Karen hesitated, then sat, adjusting her neck brace dramatically as she did. The judge turned his gaze to Emma and asked if she would like to speak. Emma nodded. She rose slowly, one hand on her belly for support, and faced the room. Her voice was calm but firm. She told the judge how she had come out that morning to feed the goats, how Karen had approached her yelling, accused her of things that made no sense, and kicked her without warning. She said she had never filed complaints before, had never retaliated, and only wanted peace. Her voice didn't shake, even when she said the words, "Karen kicked me while I was pregnant." The room fell into a silence that even Karen didn't try to interrupt. Judge Mitchell folded his hands and leaned back. He looked at Karen, then at her lawyer, and finally back at us. He said he had reviewed the evidence personally the night before and found the case to be disturbingly clear. He called Karen's actions reckless and unjustified. He said no citizen had the right to enforce authority that did not exist. Then, without raising his voice, he issued his ruling. Karen was guilty of misdemeanor assault and criminal trespassing. She would be fined and placed on probation with mandatory community service. The restraining order would be extended. Any future violations would result in immediate jail time. Karen's face twitched. Her lawyer whispered something to her, but she was too busy staring at Emma, eyes wide, mouth slightly open, as if trying to understand how things had turned so far against her. I almost pitied her in that moment. Almost. But then I remembered the look on Emma's face when she gasped and stumbled backward at the barn gate, and all that pity vanished like dust and wind. After the court dismissed us, neighbors who had come to observe approached and offered soft words of support. Oliver handed Emma a bouquet of wildflowers he had picked that morning, saying they reminded him of strength in unlikely places. Emma smiled and thanked him, placing one hand protectively over her belly. As we stepped outside, the light felt different, not just brighter, but warmer, like justice had finally reached our little corner of the world. We walked back to the truck slowly. Emma needed breaks every few minutes now, but she never complained. She said the courthouse had smelled like pencil shavings and old memories. I told her it smelled like Karen's last stand. We laughed, soft and tired. Then we climbed into the truck, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like we could go home without bracing for another fight. But the surprises weren't over. As we drove past the HOA sign at the neighborhood entrance, we saw a new notice pinned to the post. It was an emergency meeting flyer. The HOA board was holding a vote to formally strip Karen of any remaining authority. A few of the names listed as sponsors were the very people she had once fined for minor offenses. Change was coming, and it had started with a single terrible act that Karen thought no one would stand up against. That evening, back at the ranch, we grilled dinner on the back porch. The goats wandered nearby, Commander standing proudly by the fence as if guarding us. Emma leaned against my shoulder and whispered that maybe the baby would come early. I asked if that worried her. She shook her head and said no, this baby was being born into a place that had fought back against fear, against bullying, against someone who thought power gave her permission to hurt others. This baby, she said, was already strong. The stars came out slowly as the fireflies began to flicker along the fence line. We sat there until the food got cold, not because we forgot to eat, but because we didn't want to lose that moment, that feeling of peace returning, of knowing we had drawn a line in the dirt and held it with grace and patience and truth. Karen might have been loud, cruel, and relentless, but the world had seen her clearly now, not as a protector, not as a leader, but as a bully exposed by her own actions. And sometimes, when the wind shifts just right, truth speaks louder than any clipboard ever could. The morning Emma went into labor, the world was quiet. No sirens, no shouting across fence lines, no Karen patrolling the gravel like a self-declared sheriff of the suburbs. Just birdsong, a soft breeze through the trees, and the steady sound of hooves as the goats shuffled lazily through the pasture. We had been preparing for this day, but nothing ever truly prepares you for the moment it arrives. I was helping refill the water troughs when Emma called out from the porch. her voice calm, but different, the kind of tone that carries weight behind it. "It's time," she said, one hand on the doorframe and the other on her belly. I dropped the bucket and crossed the yard faster than I thought a man my age could move. We had everything ready, the bag by the door, the car gassed up, and the hospital route marked with 2 alternate paths in case of traffic. But the roads were empty, and the ride was smooth. Emma barely winced as the contractions began. She looked out the window most of the way, watching the trees pass by, her hand resting on mine. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. Everything that needed to be said had already been said in the long months leading up to this moment, in every quiet evening spent on the porch, in every shared glance when Karen's chaos tried to pull us apart. We had stayed steady. This was the final chapter of one story and the start of another. At the hospital, everything moved quickly but gently. Nurses who spoke in soft tones, monitors that beat with quiet urgency, and doctors who worked with precision and calm. I stayed by Emma's side the entire time, holding her hand, brushing damp hair from her forehead, whispering that she was doing great even when I wasn't sure if my voice sounded steady enough. Hours passed. Daylight faded. Then, in one breathtaking moment, it happened. The room filled with the sound of our daughter's first cry, raw and perfect and loud enough to remind the world that new life had arrived. We named her Lily, not because of any grand symbolism or family tradition, but because when Emma held her for the first time and looked down at her tiny face, she said the name as if it had always belonged to her. Lily, strong, delicate, and rooted in the ground we had fought so hard to protect. I kissed Emma's forehead and whispered that nothing else mattered now. Not fences or clipboards or courtrooms. Just this. Just us. Back at the ranch, things had continued to shift in quiet ways while we were at the hospital. The HOA held their emergency vote. Karen was officially removed from any remaining involvement. A notice was taped to her door, signed by a unanimous board, stating that she was no longer permitted to act in any representative capacity and that her actions had caused irreparable harm to the community's reputation. Word spread quickly. Karen didn't come out for days. Her car didn't move from the driveway. The blinds stayed drawn. Some said she was planning to move. Others said she was trying to sue the HOA itself for wrongful removal. No one seemed too concerned either way. When we brought Lily home, it was early evening. The sky was painted in soft hues of orange and pink, and the goats gathered near the fence as if they sensed something had changed. Oliver had tied a welcome home banner to the gate, made from burlap and twine. It was crooked and frayed at the edges, but it made Emma laugh. Inside the house, everything felt new again. The same rooms we had walked through 1,000 times now felt different, warmer, quieter, full of life. Neighbors began dropping by in the days that followed. Some brought casseroles, others small handmade toys or books for Lily. Oliver brought a goat-shaped plush he swore looked like Commander, though it was more blob than animal. Emma smiled through every visit, tired but grateful. I watched her move through each day with a grace I could never quite describe. She held Lily like she was made of light, whispered to her like they shared secrets no one else could hear, and walked our land like a queen returning to her rightful place. One morning, a letter arrived. It was from Judge Mitchell, a handwritten note on simple paper. He congratulated us on the birth of our daughter and added that it had been a long time since he had seen a courtroom so unified in silence during a testimony. He wrote that strength did not always show up in volume, but often in the choice to stand quietly and not back down. At the bottom, he had drawn a simple flower, a lily. No signature, just the gesture. I framed it and hung it by the kitchen door. As the weeks went by, Karen's house went up for sale. A discreet sign at first, then an official listing in the paper. She moved out early one morning before dawn. No goodbye, no notice, just a quiet vanishing act. The house sat empty for a short while before a new couple moved in. Friendly older folks with 2 large dogs and a small garden and towel. They waved the first time we passed them on the road. No clipboards. No demands. Just 2 people looking for peace. I hope they found it. One evening, just as the sun slipped behind the barn and the air turned cool, I stood at the fence holding Lily while Emma planted new flowers near the porch. The goats grazed lazily nearby, and Commander nuzzled up against the fence post with a look that made me think he was still proud of what he had done that day by the ditch. I whispered to Lily about it, about the day her mother stood strong and a goat delivered justice. Her tiny fingers curled around my shirt, and I swore she smiled. Life wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was real, and it was ours. We had stood against something mean and loud and cruel, and we had done it without losing who we were. And now, with Lily in our arms, with our land behind us and a future ahead, it felt like we had won something bigger than just a court case or a neighborhood dispute. We had reclaimed peace. We had built something rooted and true, and we were ready to grow it, one quiet day at a time.